At 74, when most people speak of rest, Eleanor Marsh was handed a court order instead. After 46 years of marriage, her husband, Gerald Marsh, walked away with the house, the savings account, and both cars, leaving her with 2 suitcases and a name she no longer recognized as her own. He believed he had taken everything. He had forgotten one thing, and that one forgotten thing would make everything he had done completely irrelevant. If this story speaks to something you've been carrying quietly, stay with me until the end, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories worth hearing. November had settled heavily over the neighborhood the way it always did. Grey, patient, indifferent. Not the kind of grey that passes, the kind that stays, that becomes part of the light itself, flattening everything beneath it into a single muted tone. The trees along the street had lost most of their leaves already, and the ones that remained clung to the branches with the particular stubbornness of things that have not yet accepted what the season requires of them. Eleanor stood on the front steps of the house, where she had raised 2 children, planted a garden that took a decade to fill in, and grown old in the slow, unnoticed way that most people do. She wore a tan coat buttoned to the top, her handbag held close at her side. Not because she was cold. She had stopped feeling that particular kind of cold years ago. The cold she felt now was different. It had no temperature, no wind, no season. It simply lived in the center of her chest and expanded whenever she was still long enough to notice it. Behind her, the movers worked in and out with a practiced efficiency that had nothing to do with her. They carried boxes, chairs, framed photographs, the small side table that had stood beside her bed for 30 years, each item handled with the same neutral care that suggested they had long since stopped thinking about what any of it had once meant to anyone. They did not make eye contact, they did not slow down. They simply moved through the house the way water moves through a space that is no longer sealed, filling every corner, taking everything with them, leaving nothing behind but the outline of where things used to be. At the end of the driveway, Gerald stood beside a silver SUV checking his phone. He looked less like a man ending a marriage of nearly 5 decades and more like a man waiting for a delayed meeting to begin. He was dressed neatly, a dark blazer, his collar pressed straight, his shoes reflecting the pale afternoon light. He checked his watch. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve. He looked down the street as though expecting something to arrive from that direction, then looked back at his phone, as though the occasion called for composure rather than conscience, as though patience, in this moment, were the same thing as correctness. "It's all squared away," one of the movers called out, brushing his palms together and stepping down from the front door for the last time. Gerald gave a short nod and tucked a folder under his arm. Eleanor had seen that folder every day for 3 months. Documents, signatures, legal seals, notarized pages with lines of fine print that reduced 46 years to a series of asset columns, page after page quietly erasing the shape of a life she had believed was hers. She had read each one. She had understood each one. Understanding had not made any of it feel real. She stepped down one stair. "Gerald, this isn't how it should have gone." He exhaled, not with exhaustion, not with sorrow, but with the soft impatience of a man who had already decided the matter was settled and found it inconvenient to revisit. "The court was very clear, Eleanor. The house is mine." She looked past him into the front hallway, the wall where their anniversary photographs had hung for 30 years, the pale rectangular outline still faintly visible on the paint where they had been. The wooden handrail Gerald had built himself, the summer their daughter learned to walk. The scuff mark at the base of the doorframe that had been there since their son came home with a bicycle too large for the entryway. Small things. The kind of things no court document ever asked about. 46 years, she said quietly. He adjusted his cuff again. "You'll be fine. There are places. Assisted options." That phrase, assisted options, landed differently than anything else he had said. Not loudly, not sharply. It simply settled into the space between them and stayed there, heavier than it had any right to be for 2 words. Eleanor did not flinch. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she did not hide them. She simply let them remain there, visible as though they no longer required managing. "I don't need assistance. You can't manage alone." His tone was unchanged. the tone of a man who had confused certainty with care for so long that he no longer noticed the difference. "That's no longer your decision to make." The wind moved through the yard, pushing dry leaves against the 2 suitcases left at the curb. Small, compact in a way that felt almost studied, as though someone had taken deliberate care to demonstrate how little space a life required once it had been properly reduced. Gerald reached into his coat and held out a white envelope. "There's enough in here to get you started." Eleanor looked at his hand for a long moment before taking it. Her fingers felt the paper without pressing into it, the way you touch something you are not yet sure belongs to you. "Started where?" He paused, just briefly. The pause of a man who had prepared for everything except that question. "That's yours to figure out." He turned and opened the car door. The engine started smoothly, almost silently. The SUV moved down the driveway in a clean, unhurried arc and turned onto the road. There was no backward glance. The street absorbed the sound of it gradually, the way streets do. First the engine, then the tires, then nothing. Eleanor stood there in the quiet that followed, still holding the envelope, still facing the road. Some part of her was still waiting, for a different sound, for the engine to return, for something to happen that would make the last 3 months feel less permanent than they were. Nothing changed. The mover's truck pulled away. The street emptied completely. A single leaf came loose from the oak at the edge of the yard and turned slowly down through the still air, landing against the side of one of her suitcases and resting there. Eleanor looked at it for a moment, then she sat down on the edge of the curb. The cold concrete pressed through the fabric of her coat. She looked down at the cracks running through the pavement between her feet, the small branching fractures that accumulate in any surface subjected to enough weight and enough time. She pressed the sole of her shoe lightly against one of them, as though testing whether it was still solid. Her hand moved slowly through her handbag, without any clear intention, searching through the familiar shapes. Her wallet, her house keys that were no longer keys to anything, a folded handkerchief, a pen. Her fingers found something she had not been looking for, something small and heavy and cold. She closed her hand around it and brought it out. An old iron key, not large, the kind made to fit a simple lock, its surface worn smooth in the places where a hand had held it many times over many years. Not her hand, her father's. She turned it over once in her palm. A memory came, not in a single image, but in pieces, the way memory often arrives when it has been undisturbed for a long time. The smell of cedar shavings, afternoon light falling through a small window at a low angle, the kind of light that makes dust visible and turns ordinary wood into something amber. A man in a flannel shirt and worn work trousers, standing back from something he had just built, arms crossed loosely, head tilted, the posture of someone assessing their own work without vanity, nodding once, to no one in particular, the quiet satisfaction of a thing done correctly. Her father had built the shed himself, on a piece of land he owned at the end of a dirt road, several hours from where Eleanor had spent most of her adult life. She had visited it as a child, then less as an adult, then not at all once the years compounded into the kind of distance that feels like geography, but is usually something else. The land had passed to her when he died. No one had ever mentioned it during the divorce proceedings. No one had ever asked about it. It had never appeared in any of the folders Gerald had carried under his arm, because no one had thought it worth writing down. Eleanor's fingers closed around the key. She sat still for another moment, the envelope from Gerald still resting in her lap. Then she set the envelope down on the curb beside her, stood up, picked up her 2 suitcases, and began walking toward the bus stop at the end of the street. She did not look back at the house. She took 2 buses and walked the last stretch on foot, arriving in the late afternoon of the second day. The paved road ended without a sign or a marker. It simply stopped, the asphalt giving way to packed dirt, and then to a narrower path that wound between old trees, whose canopies had thinned enough to let through a cold, diffuse light. The path smelled of damp earth and pine resin, and something she could not name precisely, the particular scent of a place that has been undisturbed long enough to develop its own atmosphere. Fallen leaves had accumulated along both edges of the path, deep enough in places to muffle her footsteps entirely. The sound of any road disappeared within the first few minutes. What replaced it was the movement of branches in the upper canopy and the occasional settling sound of the forest adjusting to the cooling afternoon. Her suitcase caught on roots and stones. The wheels were not made for this. She stopped several times, to switch hands, to breathe, to look back at the path behind her growing longer with each pause, to remind herself that the reason she was still moving forward had not changed since she had started. Then, at the second bend in the path where two older trees had grown apart and left a gap in the canopy, she saw it. The shed was smaller than she remembered, though she was not certain she had ever held a clear image of it in her mind. Perhaps what she remembered was the feeling of it more than the structure itself. The roof had darkened with decades of weather. The doorframe had shifted slightly on one side, leaving a gap at the upper corner. Climbing ivy had reached the lower half of the eastern wall and begun to work its way upward along the edge of the window. The wooden platform her father had built as an entrance was still in place, though two of its boards had cracked along the grain and gone soft with moisture. But the walls stood straight. The roof held. The whole structure carried itself with the particular solidity of something built not for speed or appearance but for duration, the way her father had built everything he put his hands to. Eleanor stopped a few steps from the platform. She did not move forward immediately. She stood looking at the shed the way you look at something you are not entirely sure is real, when exhaustion and hope have been traveling together long enough that the mind begins to question what the eyes report. Then she stepped forward. The platform creaked once under her weight. She took the key from her coat pocket and pressed it into the lock. It resisted. She held it steady, applied a slow, even pressure, turned it with care. A dry, clean sound. The bolt disengaging. The door opened inward on stiff hinges, swinging with a long, low creak into the dim interior. The smell reached her before anything else. Cedar, mineral oil, and something faintly sweet. The smell of wood that has been worked and cared for, and then left sealed in its own stillness for a long time. It was not the smell of neglect. It was the smell of a place that had been waiting. The light inside was low, filtered through two small windows whose glass had hazed with age. As her eyes adjusted, the interior came forward in pieces. Along the entire length of the left wall, her father had built shelves from floor to ceiling, rough-cut lumber sanded smooth, anchored directly into the studs, with the kind of hardware that was not decorative and was not going anywhere. On those shelves, his tools, hand planes arranged by size, chisels in a fitted wooden rack, each one wrapped at the blade in a strip of canvas, a set of carving gouges in a roll of oiled cloth, wooden mallets, a brace and bit set, a draw knife with its handles worn dark from use, a spoke shave, a marking gauge, a sliding bevel. Everything cleaned, everything oiled, everything placed with a deliberateness that felt less like organization and more like respect. At the center of the shed stood the workbench, 8 feet long, built from thick hardwood, with a face vise on the left end and a tail vise on the right. Its surface was worn smooth in the areas where her father had worked most often, the wood darkened and slightly glazed from decades of contact with tools and hands, and the particular oils that transfer from skin to surface over time. It did not wobble. It did not flex. It simply stood, as it had always stood, as though the concept of instability had never applied to it. Eleanor set her suitcases down and stood still in the center of the room for a long moment. She did not rush. She let the space settle around her. Then she walked to the workbench and opened the first of the 3 shallow drawers beneath it. Inside, small glass jars of finishing oil, brushes still wrapped in paper, sheets of sandpaper ordered by grit from coarse to fine, each sheet still flat. She opened the second drawer, hand-drawn sketches on heavy paper, folded once. She unfolded the first, a rocking chair, rendered in precise pencil lines with measurements noted in the margins. Her father's handwriting in the upper corner, for Eleanor if she wants it. She unfolded the second, a small cabinet. The third, a child's rocking horse, each one labeled the same way, each one waiting. The third drawer held a tin box with a fitted lid. Eleanor lifted it out, set it on the workbench surface and opened it. Inside was a letter, folded once, sealed with a strip of tape that had gone amber and slightly brittle with age. Her name on the front in her father's handwriting, careful, upright letters, the kind of handwriting that belongs to a generation that was taught penmanship as though it mattered. She sat down on the stool beside the workbench and opened it slowly. Eleanor, I built this place for you, not because you need it right now, but because you will, one day, need to know that something in this world was made entirely for you, by someone who asked nothing in return. I have watched you make yourself smaller in rooms that did not deserve the size you are. That is not a criticism. It is an observation from someone who recognizes the habit because he saw it begin. Everything in this shed is yours to use as you see fit. The tools will do what you teach them to do. The wood will respond to the care you give it. The rest is up to you, and it always has been. Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it along its original crease and held it in both hands for a long time without moving. Outside, the light was beginning to shift toward the lower angle of late afternoon. A branch moved in the wind somewhere above the roof. The door rested quietly against its frame. She set the letter in the shallow tray beside the window, where the light was strongest, where she would see it each morning when she sat down at the bench. Then she stood, walked to the door and looked out at the path and the trees, and the particular quality of silence that a place acquires when it has been holding something in trust for a long time and has finally been allowed to release it. She stayed. The first night she cleared the corner behind the door, laid out her bedroll from the second suitcase, and slept with the blanket pulled to her chin and the smell of cedar in the air. She woke once in the night to the sound of something moving in the trees outside. A deer, she thought, or the wind shifting direction, and lay still listening until it passed, and then slept again more deeply than she had in months. The second day she swept the shed completely, beginning with the rafters and working downward, carrying the accumulated dust and debris outside in an old metal pail she found beneath the workbench. She oiled the hinges of the door and the windows until they moved without resistance. She found 2 boards in the floor near the entrance that had gone soft with water damage and replaced them using lumber from the dry stack at the back of the shed, cutting each piece to length with her father's handsaw, fitting them into place, driving the nails with one of his hammers. The sound of the hammer in the quiet shed felt strange at first, too loud, too deliberate, and then after a few strokes, simply correct. She ate sparingly from what she had carried in her second suitcase, made tea on the small camp stove she had thought to pack, and sat in the open doorway of the shed in the evening, watching the light go out of the sky through the trees. On the third morning she took the first of her father's sketches, the rocking chair marked for Eleanor, and laid it flat on the workbench. She studied it for a long time, tracing the lines with her finger without touching the pencil marks, reading the measurements, following the joinery from one part to the next. Then she walked to the wood stack, selected her material, and began. She did not work quickly. Speed had never been the point of her father's shed, and she understood that even now, even after so many years away from it. She worked until the light made it difficult to see the layout lines, then stopped, covered the work, and sat with the letter and the silence. On the following morning she continued. It took 11 days. Her hands remembered faster than she had expected. Not everything, not perfectly, but enough. The muscles in her forearms ached after the first few sessions, and then ached less and then did not ache at all. The wood responded in the way good wood responds to patient work, slowly, honestly, without shortcuts. On the 12th morning, she carried the finished chair out and set it on the ground in front of the shed. She stood back and looked at it for a moment, the way her father used to look at finished work, without hurrying the assessment, without performing satisfaction for anyone's benefit. Then she sat down in it, and the chair held, and she looked out at the trees in the early mist and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. A man in a work truck came down the dirt road about an hour later, slowing when he saw the shed door open and the chair outside. He stopped and leaned out the window. "What are you making in there?" "Furniture," Eleanor said, "from the shed." He looked at the chair. "You make that yourself?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got a front porch that needs a bench. Nothing fancy." Eleanor looked at him. "Come back in 2 weeks." He nodded and drove on. By spring, the shed had become a workshop in the full sense of the word. She had completed 4 chairs, 2 benches, a set of nesting side tables, and a cabinet built from one of her father's older designs, modified slightly to account for the wood she had available, but recognizably his in its proportions and joinery. The workbench surface was marked now with the evidence of use: small cuts, oil stains, the impressions of clamps, a ring from a jar of finish left too long in one spot. Her father's tools were no longer arranged in the careful stillness of waiting. They showed the marks of being used daily, of being returned to their places each evening still warm. Word moved through the surrounding area the way useful things move in places where people still talk to one another, without intermediaries. Not as announcement, but as observation passed from one person to the next. There was a woman at the end of the back road making furniture by hand. The chairs were solid. The bench held up through a full winter on an open porch without complaint. The cabinet fit the space it was built for because she had asked the right questions before she began. A woman who ran a small inn 12 miles out drove down one afternoon and asked if Eleanor could build her 6 matching dining chairs before October. A couple renovating a farmhouse on the other side of the hill came on a Saturday morning to talk about a kitchen hutch, what they had in mind, what the room would ask of it, how much light came through the east window in the afternoon. A young man who had been teaching himself woodworking from books drove 2 hours from the city and stood in the doorway of the shed and asked, very carefully, whether there was anything she would be willing to show him. Eleanor did not accept everything at once. She had learned, or perhaps remembered, that the quality of the work depended entirely on the quality of the attention, and attention had limits that were not negotiable. She assessed what her hands could sustain without hurrying, what the shed's resources could supply without strain, what rhythm the days could hold without the whole thing beginning to collapse inward on itself. And within those limits, she agreed and made and delivered what she had agreed to make. She kept a notebook on the workbench, orders in the first section, materials and dimensions in the second. In the third section, the one she had not planned for when she began, she wrote observations. The way quarter-sawn oak moved differently than flat-sawn under the same plane, the particular sound a sharp chisel makes entering end grain cleanly, the way the light changed in the shed from morning to afternoon, and what that meant for reading the surface of a piece before finishing. In late August, on a warm afternoon when the light came through the shed windows, at an angle that made the dust in the air visible as it drifted, Eleanor heard a car coming down the dirt path. The engine was different from the trucks and older vehicles that usually came this way, quieter, more sealed off, the sound of something that cost money to maintain. She set down the hand plane she had been using, pulled the rag from her apron pocket, and wiped her hands. She did not go to the door immediately. She finished wiping her hands, set the rag down on the corner of the bench, and then stepped to the doorway. A dark sedan had stopped at the edge of the clearing. Gerald stepped out. He stood beside the car with his hand still on the door, his gaze moving across the shed. The lumber stacked along the outer wall under the lean-to, the finished chairs arranged to one side, the open door with the workbench visible beyond it, the garden she had started along the southern edge of the clearing. He looked at all of it with the careful, slightly slowed expression of a man encountering something his mental model had not prepared him for. Then his eyes found her. Eleanor did not move toward him. She did not step back. She stood in the doorway with one hand resting on the frame, her father's frame, built square and solid and true, and waited. "Eleanor," he said. "Gerald." He looked at the cabinet drying in the afternoon light beside the shed entrance. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I heard someone in town, a woman off the back road making furniture by hand, people driving out to see it." He paused. "I didn't think it would be you." "You wouldn't have." He took a few steps forward and then stopped well short of the entrance, as though some instinct told him the threshold was not his to cross. "I didn't know this place was here." "I know. I don't remember your father ever mentioning a shed. He mentioned many things you didn't pay attention to." Gerald looked down. "That's fair." He reached up and brushed his cuff, the old automatic gesture, so practiced it had outlasted the confidence that once accompanied it. "The house didn't hold up the way I expected. The costs were higher. The agent I used made promises he didn't keep. The taxes on a property that size turned out to be different from what I'd calculated. Eleanor said nothing. She turned and set the plane back on the bench, aligning it with the others. I had to sell, he said. Is that so? The apartment is not what I had in mind. She turned back to face him. You drove a long way to tell me that. He met her eyes without looking away. I drove a long way because I needed to know whether there was anything between us that could still be reached. You took the house, Eleanor said. The savings account. Both cars. The furniture I had helped choose and pay for across 4 decades of a life I believed we were building together. You stood at the end of that driveway and told me to look into assisted living. I know. Did you believe that was the end of it? He was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that is not thinking but arriving. At the time, he said. I suppose I did. Eleanor moved to the doorway again. Behind her, the tools hung in their places. The letter sat in its tray by the window. Her notebook lay open on the bench to the page she had been working on before she heard his engine. You took what you could see, she said. You left behind what was never yours to own. Gerald looked at the shed, at the workbench, at the shelves of tools, at the finished cabinet in the afternoon light, at her hands, still holding the rag, the grain of the wood dust still visible in the lines of her palms, and then at her face. There was nothing left in his expression that resembled negotiation. What remained was something older and quieter, and considerably less useful to him. The recognition of a man who has finally seen something clearly and understands, in the same moment, that seeing it clearly now changes nothing. I understand that now, he said. You should go, Gerald. He stood still a moment longer, not hoping, not asking, just standing in a place that had never been his, and finally knowing it. Take care of yourself, Eleanor. She looked at him steadily. You too, Gerald. She stepped back inside and pulled the door closed. The hinges moved without sound. The latch settled into place with a single, quiet click. Through the small window beside the workbench, she could see the clearing. Gerald stood beside the car for a moment longer. She could see the shape of him without looking directly, the way you register the presence of something at the edge of your vision without giving it your attention. Then the car door opened and closed. The engine started. The sound moved away down the path and then was absorbed by the trees, and then there was nothing. Eleanor walked back to the bench, sat down on the stool, and opened her notebook. The observation she had been writing before his car appeared was still there, unfinished in the middle of a sentence. Something about the behavior of white oak under a finely set plane when the grain runs at a slight angle to the surface. The way you learn to feel the resistance before it becomes a problem. The adjustment so small it barely registers as movement and yet makes all the difference in what the surface becomes. She picked up her pen and completed the sentence. Outside, the last of the afternoon light moved through the upper canopy and settled on nothing in particular. The clearing held the particular stillness of a late summer evening, in a place where the days have begun shortening so gradually that only the light itself knows. What remained was the shed, the tools in their places, the notebooks filling with new handwriting alongside the old, the orders on the first page, the materials on the second, and the observations, the long, careful, unhurried observations, accumulating in the third, and a life continuing, not loudly. Not in any way that would have been legible to anyone who had once believed that what could be put in writing was the only thing that counted, but continuing, firmly, on its own terms, in a place that had been built for exactly this by a man who had known, long before anyone else had thought to look, exactly what his daughter was capable of. If you stayed with this story all the way through, thank you. Stories about beginning again rarely announce themselves. They arrive quietly, the way this one did, through an old key in the bottom of a handbag, through a door that was waiting to be opened. If this story moved you, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so the next one finds you when you need it. And in the comments, write the moment in this story that surprised you the most.